And thus it begins, gentlemen. Hello, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to Makin Sense, South Africa's best news podcast and the Common Sense's flagship podcast. As always, I am joined by a panel of brilliant South Africans scattered around the world. Joining us from Germany, where he runs the Bremen Democracy Research Group, the Sage of Saxony, James Meyerberg. Broadcasting from the last vestiges of the British Empire, the Director of Wealth of Audley Capital, the Wolf of Waterloo, Simon Lincoln Reeder. Hopping across the Atlantic to Washington, D.C., we are joined by the Director of the Yorktown Foundation for Freedom, the policy wonk of the Potomac, Richard Tren, and finally, joining us from the Common Sense HQ in Johannesburg, the founder of France Cranier Private Clients and the editor of the Common Sense, our Commander-in-Chief, Franz Cranier. We have a jam-packed show today, gentlemen, but I think we want to start in the United States with the Federal Reserve. So, Richard, can you take us away with a bit of an explanation about what the Federal Reserve even is?
Yeah, I mean, the Fed has been in the news a great deal lately, and it's an important discussion point on what's happening in our economy, but also in just the functioning of government and the power of the executive and the power that Trump has in his that he's accumulating in the White House. So, what is the Fed? Think of the Fed like the Bank of England or the South African Reserve Bank. It's a lender of last resort. It sets monetary policy. It buys and sells U.S. debt. It's a very important, and this is an underreported role. It's a very significant regulator of banks, and through that role is a very important regulator of the economy. And it's a role that has not that much congressional oversight and is not reported on very much. The Fed is set up. There are 12 when it was set up in 1913. There's the Federal Reserve in Washington, D.C., but there are 12 regional Feds. With a big economy like this, it gets data from these 12 different regional Feds in San Francisco, in Cleveland, in Richmond, in Boston, Dallas, and they all contribute data and their opinions on the economy and therefore on monetary policy. And the Fed, which has a board, has a 7-person board, the Fed in Washington, D.C., and they set monetary policy. So they perhaps the most reported on an important role is they're setting interest rates. And they have a dual mandate in doing this. They want their dual mandate is to have stable prices, a low inflation, and low unemployment. And therein is, to my mind, a bit of a false dichotomy there. That the view seems to be that if you have low unemployment, so high employment, a robust, growing, hot economy, that's going to lead to inflation. And the Fed therefore sees its role in increasing interest rates, tampening down economic activity. When you have low rates, it's cheaper to borrow money for businesses. Individuals pay lower mortgage rates. They have more money in their wallets. And the Fed's view is that leads to rising prices and rising inflation. And therefore, their job is to tamp them down, is to manage the economy in this way. And I think this is wrong-headed. Milton Friedman made the point that inflation is always and everywhere a monetary phenomenon. You get inflation by central banks printing too much money. We had, during the first Trump administration, a very hot economy, high growth, very low levels of unemployment. We had millions of unfilled positions. We didn't see high inflation. Because of that, because we were producing so much. we had more stuff. We had a very productive economy. That doesn't create inflation. It's monetary policy that creates inflation. And the Friedman's thesis, that perhaps the most famous, one of the things he's very famous for is his analysis of the Great Depression, where he pointed out that the Great Depression was caused in very large part by the Federal Reserve making money supply too tight, had too restrictive monetary policy. that caused the problems of the depression. And you can look over the past 100 years, and the Fed always seems to get it wrong, either too late or too soon or too high or too low, in setting these rates, in thinking that they're in the driving seat of an economy. And you're reminded of Hayek, Friedrich Hayek, the famous free market economist, who wrote that the curious task of economics is to demonstrate to men how little they know about what they imagine they can design. So, the Fed is important, but it's playing this role that in what they think in managing an economy that I think is wrong-headed and often leads to far more damage than good. But let me stop there for a break. If anybody wants to jump in at that point, I will say one thing. What we saw after the 2008 financial crisis is much looser monetary policy, very low rates, central banks around the world pumping out lots of money to sort of juice the economy and keep things going. What that did is that led to rises in asset prices with interest rates so low. People couldn't get returns on bank deposits, so you saw this increase in asset prices. So you see this massive increase in stock prices around the world, and we had this curious position where for years now, and it happened just the other day, where good macroeconomic data is bad news for the market, because the market sees when there's good news that the Fed is going to be more restrictive, start raising rates. Whereas if there's bad news, then they're going to be much looser, and this leads to an increase in the asset prices on the stock market. So during the Obama years, the 2 terms of the Obama administration, you saw this massive rise in asset prices around the world, and in a way, it sort of exacerbated this coming apart in the U.S. economy, where those people heavily invested in the market did very well. The people who had assets to invest, whereas the sort of the typical blue collar plumber and electrician that rely on a more robust real economy saw stagnant growth and an increasing appeal to the kind of Trump economics. So that both parties, as this happened in many places around the world, that the Republican Party, always seen as a sort of country club party of the elite, changing to become the more blue collar party, whereas the Democratic Party became much more the party of the wealthy elite and the campus, the lounge, the highly educated campus elite.
The champagne socialists.
The champagne socialists, yeah. So it's kind of interesting. But let me stop there if anybody wants to jump in and get to what's been happening in the news over the Fed appointments of the last few months.
Frans, you wanted to talk about inflation and central banks?
Yeah, I mean, Richard says a lot of important things, but one to perhaps start with is what causes inflation. Because there's an idea going around parts of the Western world that inflation is caused by things like a CEO salaries and wage gaps and supply chain constraints and. But inflation can only be caused by central banks who manufacture money. That's the only driver of inflation. And I had a friend who worked for one of South Africa's big banks, who unfortunately died far too soon. And I owe him, and this is his data that I'm giving you, and he was very interested in economic history. And he shared with me and with some colleagues some amazing charts that we'd later go on to use in some of our own work. And one of his charts showed a great statistic, which was the number of dollars in circulation as a share of the size of the global economy. And that number peaked in the aftermath of the Second World War, which makes sense because of all the sort of war bonds and the like that had been issued to finance that conflict. And then from the 1950s through into the late 1980s, that number came off. And then it rose again through the late 80s and then rose particularly steeply into the present. And the argument was that central bankers in the Western world, particularly in the US, were essentially manufacturing money initially to fund the trade relations with the newly sort of freed Eastern Bloc. And then each time the world ran into a financial crisis in 2000 to 2008, or the COVID crisis, the printing presses were turned on again, and this share of dollars absolutely took off. And from there came the argument of, well, why didn't the world see vastly elevated levels of inflation through much of that period? Why was that only a phenomena really that the US experienced, well, not only then, but particularly after the COVID pandemic? And the argument was that there had been inflation, and that essentially the printing of money had been, the question was, where does the money go that's printed? Does it go to Main Street, sort of Main Street America, ordinary people and consumers, which happened at the COVID period and then drove sort of Main Street inflation? Or does it go essentially to Wall Street, to very wealthy people? And had there always been inflation, which there had been, but it was asset price inflation as opposed to Main Street inflation. And the argument from there became even more interesting, that the thesis of Piketty, that capitalism caused this vast inequality, was absolutely wrong. And that what Piketty was seeing and portraying in his data was not an effect of capitalism causing inequality in the Western world, but rather the effect of Western central banks producing money and then sending that money into asset prices, which then pulled away from the sort of net positions of sort of ordinary people that would live on Main Street.
Simon, I think maybe we can come to you to just chat us through this a bit more.
Okay, well, look, I'd like to blend Richard and France in the story of the Bank of England, because I think it is a lot older, and you'll find that what both have been saying is there, and certainly in the market's response to them. But I think context is very important, and our audience should know that the Bank of England was initially established to fund the English war against the French in 1694. Long time, thereby graduating as the issuer, the monopoly of UK banknotes, graduating more from lender, until it became what Richard mentioned earlier in the 1870s as the lender of last resort to financial institutions in distress. And then there comes a very important date in the 1940s when it is nationalized. And then it plods on through that post-war period until 1997 and the Blair administration. These guys get in, having already adjusted Clause 4 of their constitution, which is basically controlling the means of production. They've adjusted it, and by the time they get into power, something very interesting happens, in that they technically privatize the Bank of England again. They allow it to set the base rates, and they've done so for a very important thing that's happened between 1694 and 1998, and that was Margaret Thatcher's privatization drive. Now, even the most hyper-capitalists that we speak to will have to admit that despite the good that era ushered in, it also unleashed forces of capital markets that are very difficult to contain. And they speak to here now an atomization of society, if you will. What Gordon Brown quickly discovered as the new chancellor in Tony Blair's administration at that point is that they didn't possess the skill or actually wanted to control these forces, and would rather outsource that responsibility of setting the base rates and target inflation at 2% to what you call an MPC, Monetary Policy Committee, consisting of 9 members, I think, today. And thereby going, it's independent, these guys are going to figure it out. Now, that plods along. To Richard's point again earlier, 2008 comes about, and it's the global financial crisis. And for the first time in its history, in March 2009, the Bank of England deploys quantitative easing, printing of cash. So at that point, you have criticisms that, the Bank of England is targeting inflation. It's too narrow a mandate. It's not going to stimulate growth. You can argue its purpose is not to stimulate growth, but you've got an ambitious economy, and you've still got the leftovers of that Margaret Thatcher privatization era, a culture of entrepreneurship. But when that quantitative easing kicks in, again, to Richard's point, it creates a number of problems. The most obvious is the establishing of asset bubbles, housing, equities, bonds. And what that does is essentially capitalize the already capitalized and widen the inequality gap. But most importantly, and this is an underrated feature, it diverted resources away from real economy, research and development, manufacturing, and these things are to the side. Now, George Osborne comes into, as the Chancellor of the Exchequer in the Conservative Lib Dem coalition of 2010. And one of the first things he does is he establishes what you call the Office for Budget Responsibility. But it becomes very clear that there's an economic orthodoxy in the Bank of England, which then goes into the Office for Budget Responsibility. And what is that? Firstly, you always underestimate public spending. And secondly, you always overestimate the taxes that you draw. 2022 comes along. This system is now very tired, and it needs something of a revolution. And this is the part where we look at how the Bank of England and the power that it has accumulated, power perhaps that it doesn't warrant, led to the downfall of a prime minister. There's a woman called Liz Truss who inherits the Conservative government. Boris Johnson doesn't come down on his chief whip for feeling up a handsome Italian waiter hunt in a gentleman's club. So he's turfed out, okay? She comes in, and she's not perfect, but on the economy, she's got the right ideas. What happens? The Queen dies, so the country is plunged into weeks of mourning. But Liz Truss drafts 2 very important documents during that time. One is supply-side economic reforms. The other is a mini budget that includes a abolition of the rate of 45p tax for people earning £150,000 and over. So it's radical. Now, this is where the human hand of ineptitude defers revolutions. Liz Truss in 2022, she should have released the supply side reforms to the OBR and the Bank of England, effectively giving them notice, saying this is what's happening, new boss in town, and this is how it's going to be. Unfortunately, she released the mini budget beforehand. And what happened? The Bank of England used its power, which is a lot of it's concentrated in the media, who are a very willing audience, and these guys exploded the thing, and the next thing, the borrowing costs shot to where they were. And when you tell a UK boomer, or when a UK boomer hears that his mortgage is being messed with, he's out. That a politician's messing with his mortgage, they're out. And that's exactly what happened to Liz Truss, unfortunately. The Bank of England, the OBR, deferred what was a fantastic opportunity to completely revolutionise the UK economy. And subsequently, those borrowing costs now under Rachel Reeves are even higher than they were under Liz Truss. The opportunity has dashed, and we're in something you could quite appropriate describe as a doom loop. High taxes, low growth, with no sign of abetting. Yeah, I hope that's captured both Richard and France's sentiments.
Yeah, I mean, the UK seems to be back to the sort of winter of discontent time where people are talking of an IMF loan.
Yeah.
I mean, this is sort of that led it. This is not good. Yeah, and the other, I would just say to Simon, the other thing, talking about regulatory role, that who gave the Bank of England power to start talking about climate change? Climate change suddenly became a huge topic. This is nuts. This is not a monetary issue. This is something quite else.
Mark Carney did that, the current Prime Minister of Canada.
Yeah,
he was the previous governor, and he brought in the identitarian stuff into what should be, as it's mandated, inflation targeting.
Yeah. This kind of mission creep is very worrying among these central banks.
Yeah. I mean, it seems as though from both Simon and Richard, your points that the powers that the central banks have just been kind of growing and growing and growing. But these means that these institutions play an ever more important role in people's lives. And maybe, Richard, that segues us nicely into what's currently happening with the Fed in America.
Yeah. So one thing that is not reported on nearly enough is that since about 2008, the Fed has been paying banks to deposit money there and paying very high interest rates. And one of the reasons, people say, why didn't you have high inflation, taking into account France's point about asset inflation, but sort of on the high street during that big expansion of the money supply after that. Was because the banks were just sitting on the money. The deposits were just sitting at the Federal Reserve, and they're now paying about 4.4%. And there's billions of dollars that banks are sitting on, getting a very nice return on their assets at the Federal Reserve, including many foreign banks. A lot of European banks, there's a bit of arbitrage going on. They'd rather have their assets at the Federal Reserve than the European Central Bank because they get a much higher rate. And this is kind of the most, secure investment you can imagine. And the money is not going out into the real economy. These banks are not lending that money to businesses, to individuals who might actually put it to productive use. It's sitting there earning a very handsome rate of return. And that's when people start talking about the need for the Fed to start lowering rates. That is a key rate that should be reduced. We shouldn't be paying these banks, Merrill Lynch and whoever, to sit and make a very tidy return there. But coming back to the issue that's been sort of broiling for a while is Trump's threats to fire Jerome Powell, the chairman of the Federal Reserve, because Trump wants lower interest rates. He wants to basically sort of juice the economy and have lower rates that will lead to higher rates of investment. And he has held back because he doesn't want. He's sort of concerned about the market response, quite rightly, to that kind of heavy-handed firing of the Federal Reserve. But he has two things have happened in the last few weeks. One of the Federal Reserve board members resigned early, and I think her term came up. I forget her name. Sorry. But she was due to be replaced next year anyway. So there's a short period.
Lisa Cook.
No, that's someone different. Lisa Cook's term goes to 2038. I think she's at the beginning of her long term. But there was one who resigned. Lisa Cook has been fired. She's still in the position. This is going to lead to a long bit of litigation. So when there was this vacancy, Trump appointed the head of the Council of Economic Advisors, sort of his White House economic advisor, a man called Stephen Myron, who he's very aligned with Trump on economic policy, particularly on trade. He's one of those who thinks is deeply concerned about the trade deficit, something which I think he shouldn't be concerned about. But anyway, he's of this mindset that if a country exports, that's very good. It means that you're a strong country. And if you import, that's bad. That means that you're weak. And his whole objective seems to be to devalue the dollar. The dollar is the world's reserve currency. Because of that, central banks around the world hold large stocks of dollars, and it results in a relatively high price for dollars. So he wants to reset that. and including taxing foreign holdings of dollars. He wants to do that to have a weaker dollar that he thinks will increase exports. I think this is kind of a nuts view, but it is indicative of the way that Trump's economic policies, that the new sort of national conservative economic policy is playing out. In the last few days, as Simon pointed out, he fired Lisa Cook, who was a Biden appointee to the Federal Reserve. And this was, I think, perhaps sort of a pretextual firing. This all came up because it was exposed that she had been, we don't know whether she lied. I don't know whether she lied or whether she just made a mistake in her mortgage application. She has two houses. You get favorable interest rates if you get a more favorable loan conditions if you get a loan on your primary residence. And she claimed two primary residences. This might have been a mistake. We just don't know. This might have just been a clerical error. But Trump has used that to fire her and to exert more control over the Federal Reserve. This is, I'm sure, going to go to the courts. She's resisting this. It is going to be tested. The Supreme Court has already indicated it's keen to sort of test this case on what the extents are of executive power over the agencies. There's a lot of, it's debatable whether or not the Federal Reserve is an executive agency in the way that some other DC-based agencies are. To the extent that it's a major regulator of the economy, it could be seen that way, but this is something that's going to be tested in the courts. It might even outlast Trump's administration. But it's a sort of indicator. There are two things going on. It's an indicator of the strength now of Trump economic policy that is not the kind of Hayekian free market economic policy that I would prefer. It's much more interventionist. It's much more national conservative. It's much more trade restrictionist, and it's testing the limits of Trump's power over the executive. So yeah, interesting times.
And just on that point about the kind of new national conservatism of Trump's economic policy, something that we've talked about kind of privately was that there's this 10% stake that the US government wants to take in Intel. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, I mean, so this comes from what's called the CHIPS Act, where it's an act that was passed during the Biden administration that was designed to give all sorts of favorable economic advantages to chip manufacturers. And the argument is that these are systemically important industries, and for national security reasons, we need to have our own domestic chip manufacturers. So Intel is a company that's in trouble. It hadn't actually taken the funds yet, but in return of releasing them, Trump is negotiated, let's put it that way, a 10% stake in the industry. What you're seeing is kind of what's the term that I like? Pretzel logic. The way in which people who had Kamala Harris won and done this kind of thing, Republicans would be setting their hair on fire, saying this is creeping socialism. The government has no role in this. We cannot allow the government to start getting involved in buying companies, but having shares and therefore control over companies that should be left to the free market. But it's an indicator of just how powerful Trump has become over the Republican Party, that there are very few that are actually speaking out. There are a few senators, Rand Paul among them, the more libertarian among the US senators that have come out against this. And in response, Trump has said, well, he's going to start taking shares in other companies, including a defense industry. This is taking us down a dangerous path, and I'm not into it. Count me out.
Can I just push you on that just a little bit? That in the case of the specific company, it makes a product which you might argue, is almost without precedent in terms of these chips, in terms of their influence on global national security balances. And isn't there a legitimate concern that if that other powers, China, etc., will certainly try and sink their claws into such a company, and that the stake that Mr. Trump wants to take in exchange for essentially a US subsidy, actually in this case, and I share a lot of your other concerns, but in this case, there actually is a valid national security argument.
Yeah, there might be. And we certainly saw after COVID a lot more discussion of the kind of national security concerns about an economy overly reliant on China, say for active ingredients of pharmaceuticals, an entire pharmaceutical supply chain that is reliant on other countries. But yeah, you could make that argument. I remain skeptical that is taking us down a useful path. If you want that, well, then there are all sorts of regulatory reforms that you could enact to make it much more attractive for companies to start investing here. But for the government to take a stake to essentially partly nationalize a major company like this is dangerous. You'll then have elected officials who will have a say in where Intel operates, what it can do, what it starts producing. Why do we want that? That leads to a less dynamic economy. If we want to be a strong economy with a growing chips market, let's take government restrictions off. Let's allow those markets, make it attractive for them to start investing here. But to take a stake, I think this is dangerous and could lead to a weakened chips industry rather than a stronger one. That's my opinion.
Just to kind of argue it.
Yeah.
Don't think that I disagree with you, but one of the features of this new Trump administration, and I think he's a bit of a moderating influence on it, and perhaps what will come after him if the sort of lineage continues, was a sense that old-fashioned sort of Republicans, conservatives were naive, that their trust in freedom of speech simply provided platforms for enemies of the Western order to organize against them, that their sort of what they might see as their blind confidence in free trade simply gave advantages to their global rivals who had long-term objectives to do great damage to their economies, and that this could all be distilled down to the idea, or that's the essence of the argument, that old-fashioned conservatives, maybe classical liberals, were made a terrible strategic mistake in not being willing now and again to dip into state power in order to secure the future of the Western order. And if they were to make that argument, having what you've just said, and put that to you in that way, how would you answer them?
Well, I mean, you can look at countries that have been doing that, and we can look at most of the EU, Western Europe, but is much more interventionist in this way. What's happened over the last 15, 20 years? The US economy has doubled in size, and Europe has flatlined. Who's stronger? This idea that a lot of the sort of the pro-Trump MAGA group will say is that we've lost our manufacturing base. This is nonsense. We're a huge manufacturer. We just don't produce the same things that we do, but we have a very robust, strong economy. We produce different things. Economies evolve, and to try and keep them stuck in amber because you have some romantic vision of the 1950s, which was a high growth era of people manufacturing, working in factories, producing things, is kind of fanciful. We just produce different things. And look, it's a dynamic economy. There are going to be people who are left behind. I think we can talk long conversation, if you like, about what the state can do to help those people. But the idea that intervening and having government taking control of companies as a way out of this, I think, is fanciful, and history does not support that idea. We want to be strong. We need a strong, high growth, dynamic economy, and we're seeing sections of this happen. So if you look at the energy sector, we have an amazing team with the combination of the Chris Wright, the Secretary of Energy, the Secretary of Interior, Doug Burgum, and Bergen, and then the EPA administrator Zeldin, creating policies that is unleashing the energy sector in ways that I've never seen, and attacking the anti-growth, the almost degrowth agenda of the climate alarmism, and that is being challenged on a very robust and aggressive stance, which I fully support. That's terrific. But, and then Trump's policies are undermining in other ways, particularly in trade and the huge uncertainty that companies have. Sorry, I'm rambling on a bit here, but I think if we want a strong, robust economy and a powerful nation that can defend Western values, let's get the government out of the way and let our amazing dynamism of this economy flower.
Richard, I just want you to know that my romantic visions of America date back to the 1780s, and I'd like to exhume George Washington's corpse to lead the country again.
Wooden teeth and all.
Yes, exactly. I mean, they'd still be there at least. But I think what you were talking about before we kind of got a little sidetracked here of the kind of clash of visions and this new wave of conservatism that sees, as France you mentioned, that sees a kind of in new role for the state that otherwise conservatives hadn't kind of seen before, that this clash is also playing out in the United Kingdom now. There's a kind of new wave of conservatism and a vibe shift that's happening there with reform. For the audience, just to kind of paint you overview of where the United Kingdom is at. Last year, there was a general election. After 14 years of the Conservatives being in power, there was a massive shift in Parliament to the Labour, with the new Prime Minister Keir Starmer taking over. At that point, there was a lot of optimism. Thought the Labour kind of shadow cabinet had been going out talking about growth, talking about how they were going to help the UK economy explode. And as Simon's pointed out earlier in this episode, that's kind of come a little bit to naught. But off the back of this kind of disappointment of the 14 years of Conservatives from 2010 to 2024, and now this new Labour government unable to make good on the promises that they made to the electorate, there's been an increasingly aggressive and agitated kind of vibe in the United Kingdom, which has seen Nigel Farage, who runs the Reform Party, rocket up to the top of the polls. And it has also seen a kind of number of different responses on the ground level. So right after Keir Starmer is elected, there is a riot after the a stabbing incident in which a few young teenage girls were killed in Southport in the United Kingdom, and that sees riots break out. And since then, there have been continuing kind of protest actions, riots happening in small towns, mainly small towns across the United Kingdom, mainly about the idea of the frustration around illegal immigration. And the newest kind of indication of this has been a desire and a push for people in the UK to fly the Union Jack. Hail Britannia, the British Navy shall dominate the seas again. But this seems indicative of another vibe shift, because it takes quite a lot, I think, to get the average dour Briton to get up and do something. And I think, Simon, you can speak a little bit more about this, but I think that there is definitely the sense that the frustration has crept in, and what the Conservatives were unable to do. And maybe there is now a desire for a new kind of conservatism that is more muscular, because that appeals to maybe the baser senses in the electorates that are frustrated across the Western world at the kind of their government's lackluster performances.
Sure. So just a few points there. Firstly, those girls that were murdered in Southport were under the age of 10, 3 young girls. And the vacuum that was created after their murder has been directly linked to the riots that pursued, and that is the fault of the government. This is documented now. And just as okay, so we're talking about the shape of conservatism. You've got MAGA in the US, and then you've got this emerging now. I know MAGA in the US. I was in the US when January the 6th, 2021 happened. I was staying there for a while. I've seen it through the Biden years of excess, especially with the emphasis on identity politics and the subsequent responses. What is happening here is something very different. I'm not sure if it's new or whether it's being awoken. And it's being prompted by many forces. This kind of patriotism, which, as Gabriel pointed out, you saw last weekend in this trend of people flying, not the Union Jack, there's a difference. They're flying the St. George's flag. Okay, that's a lot more aggressive. That's England. And it's a lot more blunt, and it means it's a lot more direct. And this is not just about illegal immigration. There are multiple forces, and one of which the four of us have discussed in some detail, which was the handover, the United Kingdom handing back the Chagos Islands in the Chagos Archipelago of the Indian Ocean, which is home to a shared nuclear base between the US and the United Kingdom called Diego Garcia. And so that's one of many, all right? But that one in particular has left a mark upon traditional patriotism. And patriotism up until now, you see it at the Newlands Boxing Day cricket test when England play. You see it on Spanish resorts where they have rows of all-you-can-eat English breakfasts and the people that go to places like that. It's coming out in another form here. It's angry. It's angry at Labour's dashed, at the broken promises. It's also angry, as Gabriel says, at this attitude toward illegal immigration and the consequences which are now revealed in the ongoing of a court trial. An occupant of a hotel specifically closed to everyone else, only used for illegal immigrants, has been arrested and charged with the sexual assault of a young local girl. This is in Essex. These are things that are just prompting this. Yeah, look, I mean, we could take this discussion into another level where you've got an associate of mine called David Betts, who's a professor of war studies at King's College University in London. And he's saying that the conditions for a civil war are met. The criteria that he, through his studies, has documented and through his scholarship has, that's where this is. And this is no longer some quarter of 4chan, that the internet forum or the right-wing YouTube. This is now a discussion that's been had at the level it should be. There is a level of intolerance, a level of frustration. And my concern here is that no party, not even Nigel Farage, is talking to these people as they needed to. One thing that I admire about MAGA is that they were able to communicate things are going to get better, just relax, okay, don't go to the streets, don't burn everything down, let's just take this through the official course. No one's doing that in the UK. No political party has that sort of rapport with its members, and it's very, very worrying.
There's something here that I just looked up that you must have a view on, which is a polling, slightly dated, but very, very from an authoritative source, that 8 out of 10 English adults, so not Britons, English adults who are conservative voters have a positive view of people who fly the St. George's Cross. But a majority of Labour voters who are English have a negative view of people who fly the St. George's Cross. So that's a very stark political divide, Simon.
Very much so. And that goes to people that are very unhappy with the state of the country's appearance to the world and how it is being supposedly changed by Keir Starmer, doing things like pursuing aggressively this giveaway of these military strategic islands in the Indian Ocean for no apparent reason and without being forced to. So all of these forces together are creating a very, very evident friction here. Back to you, Gabriel.
Amongst older people, so let's say people age 65 and older, again, 80% approve. But amongst younger people, let's say those under the age of 24, there's a small margin of approval in England, but it's pretty neck and neck. So you have both a political split here, and you've got a very clear generational split with younger Britons and younger English people being at best deeply divided on something like that flag.
Yeah.
For sure. I would like to take us away from the focus on the West for a second and hone in locally France, because I think the theme of changing governance is appropriate for the poll numbers, the DA poll numbers that have come out about the Gauteng metros. So can you take us just quickly through what the DA has found and where it's at and what we should be thinking about the next local government elections?
Yeah, there's been a bit of a I don't know what it is, but the DA put out some, or didn't really put out, so somehow some DA numbers found their way into the press, which suggested that at a local government level, support for the ANC was extremely low, let's say roughly below 30% in metropolitan areas of Gauteng. Now, if you're not in SA, Gauteng is the kind of economic heartland. It's the sort of banking sector and center of the country. It's very urban. Sort of concrete Los Angeles is something Americans that visit here, so it reminds them of. And 20 years ago, the African National Congress had very strong majorities in Gauteng, about 60% plus of the vote. And these polls suggest that those numbers might now have been halved or even more than that. Now, the DA polling operation is extremely expert. The data is very, very solid. There's been a silly dispute in the South African press about the quality of the data, which shouldn't have arisen at all, because some DA people just said, this isn't necessarily a forecast of an election that's still likely more than a year away. It's very tentative early numbers with a fairly large margin of error. And I think that's caused some people to be dismissive of the numbers in their entirety, which is absolutely wrong. Because regardless of margin of error and regardless of the months out from South Africa's next local government elections, the overall finding that ANC support in the urban heartland of the country is down, let's say 50% over 20 years. That finding, I think, is absolutely rock solid.
Yes, and just what if the ANC is to fall as low as the DA has them on, what does that mean for Gauteng and for the future governance of SA?
Yeah, well, that's a big question, is where does this... I think the next year or early 2027, South Africa will have local government elections. So those are elections to elect municipal authorities and the like all around the country. And they're different from national level elections, which elect the national leadership and the leadership of the key provinces. Now, last year, South Africa had a national election, and the same African National Congress that once seen its support peak at almost 70% of the vote came in at just 40%. If it now loses considerable ground in a province like Gauteng, and it's also set to lose a considerable amount of ground in the East Coast, and the East Coast municipal districts and the major city of Durban. It's already lost the Western Cape province, which is kind of the rival of Gauteng, governed outright by the opposition, the Democratic Alliance. All that's really left for them at that point is basically dusty scrublands. But the significant share, majority of GDP in the country will, in very many respects, be outside of the hands of the party of Mr. Mandela. Then factor into that South Africa's current leader, Cyril Ramaphosa, leader of the African National Congress, is a very much more popular figure. I mean, his popularity has fallen sharply, but a very much more popular figure than anyone who might take over his party. And he commands still some respect and confidence, which many of his peers would not. If at the same time, he will, let's say, he will likely retire at the end of 2027. So if the African National Congress loses the urban centers of the country, loses that really important East Coast, it's already lost the southern parts of the country. It's got just the scrublands left. And it then loses its last leader capable of generating much by way of national, international respect. Then, yeah, that's the question many of us are wrestling with. We're not really prepared to answer it confidently at this stage. But one of the outcomes, if you sit in our meetings and hear what we talk about, one of the outcomes is just how low can they go? Could they, within a matter of just a few years, be at a point where they have 20% of the national vote or even less? And in that case, where to for South Africa? Who replaces them? Or does no one replace that share of the vote? And does South Africa, in many respects, I'm sure a theme you'll draw out of us on this podcast, hopefully over many years, does South Africa, in a sense, balkanize? In the sense that it's a very young country established in 1910. It doesn't naturally hold together for what you might call the Union of South Africa to hold together. You could argue it needs a strong nationalist administration sitting in the capital, commanding a strong national majority. And if that is now, which it's had in various guises over the last 100 years, but if that is now over and there's nothing to replace it, does the union, in a de facto sense, fracture? South Africa balkanizes into enclaves. And I don't think we'll get into all of that today, but because it's a long story. Just if that sounds a bit dark and unpleasant to you, we don't think that's the case. We think that some of those enclaves might represent some of the world's most exciting emerging markets of the next 20 or 30 years.
Richard?
Yeah, I just had a question for us for the non-South Africans. Why is Gauteng so important, and how economically important is it? Of, let's say, what's compared to the Western Cape? Would this be picking over the remnants of a once strong economy, or is there still enough potential there for that to be an important economic gain? The other thing is just you led into this, but if you see the eastern coast going one way, would we then be seeing two very divergent economic policies coming out of key areas? One going far left, one going more centrist. And why is that a bad thing? Or is it not a bad thing?
I don't think it's necessarily a bad thing. The term balkanization has negative connotations, but it's quite a good descriptor for what may happen. But we don't mean to assign the negative connotations to it. Let me try and deal with all of that. Is Gauteng important? Extremely so. It was the centerpiece of the gold fields upon which South Africa's industrial economy was built. That's why there is this city on this high plateau in the center of the country, and why a lot of its urban center is in the middle of the country, up on this plateau, and not on the coast where you'd expect major cities to be. It is the home of the urban middle class, much of it, and the aspirant middle class, which is just as important. Younger people who aspire to an essentially comfortable Western middle class standard of living. Its economic importance is being rivaled by the Western Cape, certainly, but not to the extent that Gauteng's importance has fallen away at all. Politically, its importance is perhaps even greater, because if the African National Congress loses control of Gauteng, what that in fact means is it's lost the confidence of the black urban voting market, middle class and aspirant middle class. And it must fall back on a rural political market. Now, in South Africa, rural people have been migrating to cities at a very great rate. And the age of the rural population, the average age, is therefore increased. And in some cases, a significant share of people are approaching max average life expectancy. So there is no long-term political future for a political party that is forced to double down on staging a political series of campaigns out of rural South Africa. It's just not feasible that you're going to be nationally dominant if that is what you do. So the Gauteng race, South Africans have up to this point not been terribly animated about local government elections, but sort of local councils and the like. But this one next year is going to be different, because what happens in Gauteng will probably, as much as anything, foretell whether the African National Congress Party, which was the party of Mr. Mandela, whether that party actually has any prospect of recovering the support that it's lost, or whether, which is a different point, its demise, its loss of support might deepen, and whether it could, for example, see support levels that reach, it's impossible to say now, but 20%, 15% in the fullness of time.
Thanks.
James?
Yeah, I just an additional comment in regards to that rural base of the ANC. Perhaps outside of the Eastern Cape, I'm not so sure how, if that's actually such a strong reservoir of support, or if that's just I think as it expresses the attitude in those areas of voting for the people who are in power, and that once the ANC is out of power, those people will also shift. So in which case the ANC could fall very hard and very fast, once they ejected from Gauteng and these main metro areas. I don't think they can rely on that, those areas in the long term as well, once they're seen as being pastored and out of power. I think a lot of those rural votes will go to the next, they'll carry on voting for the people in power, and once ANC is no longer in power, they may well shift away from them as well. So the ANC has to be very careful.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think that's exactly right. The nuance I didn't properly bring out, and goes to the point on balkanization, that it's not just a split between the relative middle classes in their enclaves and the poor. The balkanization will be, in fact, that the fracturing of the Union of 1910 into a whole series of different pieces, some of which will, we think, be very successful, and others that might not be as successful.
Just a last fact to kind of round out the importance of Gauteng that wasn't mentioned is that a quarter of the voting population in the country will vote in Gauteng. But moving...
And that East Coast is another significant chunk. That's also essentially lost to the African National Congress now. I get the feeling, and then I know we're going to move on, but that if you were to sit at a strategy or planning meeting of that party, the sense must be of the walls closing in around you now. And the thing we wonder about is could that closing in be much faster and more dramatic than anything we have been able to consider? So a lot of thinking on that. Gabriel.
But I think that this conversation, we're talking about where the ANC is now, but I want to talk about a document, James, that you wrote in 1998, was it? The Death of the Rainbow Nation. This, could you just tell us a bit about this document, what you were trying to achieve, how it was received? Yeah, I'll hand it over to you, James.
Sure. I was a researcher in Parliament for the Democratic Party in 1997. And, the ANC, in sort of its public image in the West and even in South Africa, was famous for its supposed non-racialism. And as the alternative as it emerged to apartheid, it was seen as the party. I mean, apartheid was notorious around the world for institutionalized racial discrimination, race classification. Those were seen as the core of the evils. And the ANC was sort of, I think they were so desperate for an alternative that qualities of non-racialism or whatever were then attributed to the ANC. So there was a sort of, I think, a misguided perception that when the ANC came to power, it would be this agent of a non-racial South Africa. If you knew the ANC well, I think you would have known differently, but for normies or whatever, that was how it was perceived. But the ANC itself, was and is, and it saw itself as a revolutionary nationalist organization. So after it had secured power and its grip on the levers of power were secured, it then started reasserting its sort of historic mission, and that entailed a very aggressive application of what it called demographic representativity. And that was the idea that all institutions across the economy, across the society, initially the state and parastatal organizations, had to conform to the racial proportions of society. And obviously achieving those goals, which required both a return of race classification and also of race discrimination, or affirmative action, if you wanted to use that term. And that started emerging in about 1997. Across various spheres, it was clearly now going to be a major priority of the ANC government. And so I was then with the Democratic Party. It had almost been wiped out in 94. It had 7 MPs in the National Assembly. And we sort of in the research department and sort of started preparing a document saying, look, this is, you thought you were going into a sort of non-racial alternative to apartheid, but in fact, this is a government which is obsessed with race and with applying this principle of demographic representativity. And then the document that emerged from that was called The Death of the Rainbow Nation. And it emerged, it was published in about March 1998. The ANC and its sort of apologists in the press then went absolutely ballistic. How dare you criticize, the ANC and its project? It was lambasted in Parliament, lambasted in all the newspapers. But it had this sort of, it helped have the effect. I don't know if it was one factor. Then actually there was a huge shift in support of opposition voters away from the National Party towards the Democratic Party at the time. So that was its background. One of the interesting things going back and looking at the document, which is it said that these policies of race-based affirmative action are going to and drawing on comparative studies. I mean, I just come out of UCT where it had learnt these things. Is that it benefits an elite and pretty much no one else. And so what's so striking about recent opinion polling that there's been done by the Social Research Foundation, but also by Ipsos, is that that's how it's perceived. When you ask people who benefits from affirmative action, the answer of ordinary South Africans across the board doesn't matter if you know what race you are. They say it's the elite and the politically benefited connected who benefit. Yeah, so that's the story of that.
And
Can I jump in and make a quick comment there? So a few years ago, there was an important US Supreme Court decision against affirmative action in US universities, stopping them from using race as a determinative factor in admitting students to universities, and that's been ruled as unconstitutional. What's amazing is how little pushback there's been. I mean, some of the universities are trying to keep this alive, but among the broad populace, these kinds of policies remain unpopular. Years ago, California banned them, and you didn't see any kind of outrage. In fact, you saw better outcomes for the minorities that were supposed to be benefiting from these policies without affirmative action than with. There's a lot to be said there, and it's so just to reiterate James's point, it seems like in this country too, divvying people up by race is a very unpopular thing, and it typically does more harm to the people it purports to help than good.
I want to ask you a question though, James, because obviously now we're almost 30 years down the line from when you first published this paper. And a lot of the things that you wrote about then kind of was pretty prescient. You know, you talk about how opinion polling now reflects the claim you made then that affirmative action benefits the politically connected and the elite. But did you see at the time when you were writing the document that these policies and this policy platform would have the effect that it has had on the support for the ANC and on the ANC's ability to govern as well? Because I think one of the things that isn't often talked about is that, you know, it's not just the effect on the South African state, the negative effects on the South African state that the affirmative action has had, but also in the ANC internally. You know, the policies have made it so that the ANC doesn't put merit as the forefront of sort of deciding who will be given what position within the party.
Yeah, I think what came a bit well again with the ANC, these are always what the ANC wanted to do, but for a time they disguised what they were going to do. So cadre deployment sort of follows on a bit later. You know, not so much the practice, but the ANC becomes confident enough to declare that this is what they intend to do. I mean, the ANC's held power for a long time. The sort of great de Tocqueville quote, though, that where he a phrase which is, I think, usefully applied to the ANC, which is that their greed counterbalanced their ambition. And they went so hard and so fast with what were to give them their true name, sort of Africanization policies, and they were so damaging, and they removed all these institutions that allow you to govern effectively, that it just left the ANC in a big mess. Without a civil service that was able to do things properly for them. Without even the ability to get the private sector to perform functions for you. So yeah, it ended up, I think, as a form of self-sabotage.
And speaking of self-sabotage, I think we're going to turn our attention for the final story of today to look at another blueprint of state capture around the world. This is something that many of the South African listeners might take some heart in, that we aren't alone in the fact that our country can be captured by politicians and outside interests. And we'll turn our attention to who officially seems to be one of our closest allies, the Republic of Iran. Franz, do you want to tell us about what the state capture project of Iran looks like?
Yeah, well, Iran's obviously a lot in the news for many reasons globally. And we think about different parts of the world and how they might evolve, and so Iran would definitely be on that agenda. And there's sort of thinking of regime change, and might the Iranians be bombed into that? Could the leadership be eliminated? Would the Western world, would Israel sort of sponsor an overthrow? And in thinking through that, we came across two other trends, which have very little to do with the Western world or Israel, which we think might be even more influential in determining what happens to the administration in Tehran. And the first relates to crippling water shortages, and the second to crippling electricity shortages in Iran. And the thinking is along these lines, that after the revolution in 1979, the new leadership is, of course, very worried about what the military might get up to. Might it wish to bring about another change in leadership. And to deal with that, the military was positioned to take a quite influential role in the Iranian economy, ranging from large infrastructure projects to various other things. And the thinking of the leadership seemed to be that if you could keep the military interested in making money, they might not focus on the sort of overthrow might become a habit of regimes. And one of the projects where the water problem comes from, one of the projects that was particularly lucrative was the building of dams. And a number of dams were built in the incorrect places and with no real reason for them, and had the consequence of obstructing water courses and causing the salinization, I think that's the term, of a lot of Iranian water or critical water resources. At the same time,
Francis, to make it, what do you mean by salinization?
The water becomes brackish because it's dammed up, and there's sort of salt layers and things that then permeate into it and cause a problem. That's my sort of professional hydrological description of how it occurs. And this problem was exacerbated by a second state strategy, which was a food independence and security to insulate Iran against the effects of any sort of embargoes, having to import too much. And massive state agricultural projects were driven that sunk a lot of wells that were often wasteful and sucked up the groundwater, far too much of it, and then also salinated, if that's the term, much of Iran's groundwater, causing a crisis. And in the present, around Tehran, which is the capital city of almost 10 million people, there's an absolutely dire water shortage. Now, Iran has faced a drought. That is correct. But it's interesting to see how even some Iranian regime commentators blame this all on climate change, when any long-term read so let's say 100-year read of Iranian climate data shows cycles more than an abrupt change in circumstances. So there's a water crisis, and water crises are politically very dangerous because they have such an immediate effect on the living standards of people that they can breed a sense of something. And you can see that in I think just in the last week, Netanyahu tweeted or something to the effect that the Iranian thirst for water was in fact a thirst for freedom, to which senior Iranian officials responded by saying that was wrong, and he was causing trouble where he shouldn't. Now, in parallel with the water problem, there's an electricity problem and periods of what South Africans would know to be load shedding. And if you're not in South Africa, that's periods where the national grid can no longer meet demand, and so power is shut off for a few hours a day or several hours a day. And that is politically very dangerous too. I mean, just the South African example, we've spoken about the steep decline of ANC support. I don't think it would have been as steep at all were it not for the very visceral experience of recent years of families, businesses, and so on, sitting in the dark, sometimes for several hours a day. So Iran faces these joint threats, and perhaps more. The point is just this, then, perhaps, and just on the electricity, a very interesting tangent to that. Is Iran at one point was mining a significant share of the world's crypto coins, which is energy very intensive and thought to have contributed to the electricity crisis. The point of all of which is to say that as one thinks about the future of the administration in Tehran, it's perhaps the domestic and social and economic factors which are as much a threat to that administration's grip on power as anything that the Western world or the Israelis might cook up. And the last point there, and I give it back to you, is in the recent bombing campaign of Iran, it would have been pretty straightforward to eliminate much of the Iranian leadership, but that seems to have been expressly something that was not done. So it would seem to suggest that what threat there is domestic, social, and economic circumstances, perhaps even to a greater extent than anything from outside.
And do you think that there's an argument to be made that with Iran in such a state that it might be more in the interest of the Israelis and in Netanyahu to keep the Iranian regime hobbled and moving forward because it's very useful as a unifying force internally, as opposed to actually trying to get rid of the regime outright?
Yeah, I
Richard,
think you
I
can
think you want to comment.
definitely. Yeah,
Richard?
Sorry. Yeah, I had just wanted to say, so back in get France's sense of this. So there was during the Obama administration, it was the Green Revolution, which is widespread demonstrations against the Iranian regime, which was rhetorically supported by the United States, but then very little happened. And there was a brutal crackdown, many people killed and imprisoned. I'm not sure what the Obama administration would have done. What's your sense of what the Western democracies should do if there is a sort of widespread uprising against the the Islamic regime? And just before I ask Franz to finish that question, I think it might also be maybe not so much interest in internal Israeli politics to have Iran, the Islamic regime, still standing, but maybe to keep the Abraham Accords intact. There you have the Gulf states and Saudi Arabia who have a common enemy who hate the Iranians as much, if not more, than the Israelis. So maybe this is having a dangerous regime limping along is good to keep those accords alive and perhaps expanding.
Well, I'll just make the argument for you with that the cliched answer in sort of Western liberal circles would always have been, well, you support the revolution, obviously, but now you get this hesitance on the part of countries with the power to actually bring that result about, to do it, and there's some thinking on that, which is this, that if the regime in Tehran collapsed And if in the aftermath of that, Iran became a sort of cosmopolitan society where people went on holiday routinely from the West, and women wore bikinis on the beach. What would the long-term implication of that be? And the initial cliched thinking is, well, that sounds fine. But is it really? Because give that a generation or so, and the fear of Iran, the fear in the Gulf states, the fear of the Saudis, fear of the Jordanians, the fear that the Egyptians have of Iran would dissipate. It would be gone, that great threat. And over that long period of time, a generation, perhaps into a second generation, wouldn't the broader gaze of the Arab world turn to what it might then see as the blight of Israel in its midst? And the argument is this, that Israel's survival depends on the bulk of the Arab world fearing Iran more than it hates the Jews. And that any short-term action that threatens the regime in Tehran, along the lines of typical sort of traditional Western liberal thinking, would actually bring about, in the fullness of time, a more fundamental shift in power balances in the Middle East, that whether those would be in the interests of Western society or not is something that can be argued.
Yeah,
James,
maybe. I mean,
sorry, Richard.
I don't know. I mean, so we have the Abraham Accords. What's been startling is since the October 7th, not a single Abraham Accord country has abandoned the Accords or broken ties. I don't know. Trump makes valid points, but let's see what happens after you have a generation of Gulf Arabs actually trading, working, cooperating with Israel. Maybe they see that actually Jews aren't these horned devils that they must exterminate. Maybe they see they can all prosper. I don't know. It's hard to. The future is difficult to predict, turns out.
Yeah, my sense of it would be that you would really be rolling the dice on the future of Israel if you did not have a powerful threatening Iran. And my guess of it is that a lot of Western contemporary thinking on Iran is weaken it to the point that it certainly cannot have a significant nuclear arsenal. You know, the danger of nuclear arsenal is that you have many nuclear weapons. So you can't take them all out at once, not that you might have one or two. Weaken Iran so that it cannot have a nuclear arsenal, a real arsenal where it could threaten the West. And then leave it be, leave it in place. And I think that's where we spoke earlier about this new sort of conservatism in America that's so skeptical of traditional American conservative thinking. And I think that also becomes relevant here. The idea that Western democracies should use their power and influence to try and bring about change in the rest of the world. I think that's also on the way out in a great many respects, and then feeds the idea that, weaken Iran so that it can't have an arsenal, but don't go beyond that to roll the dice on what happens if that regime were to fall out of power.
James, you want to jump in here?
I suppose there's a lesson from the South African experience, especially that of the old regime. You know, in the late 80s, there was the collapse of communism. The Soviets were trying to wind down proxy wars, and then they themselves disintegrated. And the ANC lost its main sponsor of the armed struggle. And I think at that moment, you had the de Klerk government and the National Party think now we're in our strongest position. And so they set about the reform process and unbanning the ANC and whatever. And it was based on, I think, a fundamental misconception, which was that the West will still stick with us. And in fact, what the West did is they said, oh, well, communism's gone. The ANC's as a former proxy of the Soviet Union, is no longer a threat to us, and a threat to our interests because the Soviets are no longer there. Now we can shift our support away from this old regime, which we actually dislike, and we'll move our support across to the ANC, and that happened very quickly. So by 94, the ANC was getting huge support from Western democracies, Britain, the UK, France, the US, I suppose, perhaps as well. So one has to be very careful what you wish for. You think you're in a very powerful position because your main adversary has sort of lost or its main sponsor has disappeared. But in fact, that's when people who've sort of been your sort of allies, because they've also feared your adversary, think, oh well, we no longer under threat. Now we can shift away from you. So it's actually a very perilous moment. That point at which Iran is no longer, people stop worrying about Iran, stop worrying about its nuclear program, about its intentions. You have to. Things can move against you very quickly in those circumstances.
Yeah, I like your use of the term fundamental misconception. I would say, if you put yourself in the position perhaps to think from an Israeli perspective, you'd easily use the same term, that it might be a fundamental misconception on the part of Israeli thinkers and strategists to think that it is in their interests to bring down the regime in Tehran, and that they should, on the contrary, look perhaps to an amazing thing to say, but you get the point if you're listening to this of what we're trying to make here, to in fact be cautious that it doesn't collapse.
Thank you, France, and that feels like a great place to leave it. And hopefully, through the years that this podcast continues, we will dispel many fundamental misconceptions that people do have. But thank you to our esteemed panel for this first episode, and thank you to all of you listening at home, and tune in next week for another episode of South Africa's Best Newscast. I'm Gabriel Makin, and this has been Making Sense.